I'm very, very pleased to be introducing Andrea Bartoli and John Radford. And both of them have extensive experience about what they've done and the accomplishments that they've achieved. And I've also had the privilege of knowing them from the inside out as well. So the heart and minds of these really remarkable peacemakers. So so Andrea is joining us from South Sudan, where he is right now, as part of Sant'Eligio, Italian peacemaking organization. And Andrea himself is the president of the Sant'Eligio Foundation for Peace and Dialogue. He's had extensive experience as a dean in both the the School of Conflict Analysis and Resolution from in Washington, D.C., as well as in the Andrea, you can tell me again what the name of the second deanship, because I'm doing this out of my
Seton Hall University.
thank you, Seton Hall University. So it's had extensive experience with diplomacy and also connected with Columbia University and the dynamic systems theory that Peter Coleman has been working on. So this ways of interconnection has been so important in the conflict field. And it also is, I'm very pleased that Awel or Yolanda Dang and David Topper joining us, who are both students that I've had a chance to learn from in the Royal Roads community, and both of them have lived experience in South Sudan. But Sant'Eligio itself has had peacemaking experiences in Mozambique, as well as Guatemala and Algeria, and Andrea has been a part of that, and as a supporter and as a connector. And John Radford, as you've read in the introduction, has his roots of conflict engagement in South Africa preceding the release of Nelson Mandela. And John himself established a mediation center and had extensive experience working by doing, as Cheryl Picard did as well, a master practitioner in the earlier days when there wasn't this kind of formal training. But that John Radford also had experience with George Mason University, so that there's connections there, as did Jamie Price, so that there's these interconnections like an ecosystem has the connections that we can't really see but are there nonetheless. So John has worked in the South African conflicts in a way that also helped to establish the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was a template of truth-seeking and reconciliation that we're also working on today in Canada. And John has taught me an enormous amount about reconciliation and engaging and building capacity for conflict. And so his work also now is in Canada. He's been here for more than 20 years, working on the west coast of British Columbia with another one of our attendees as well as Jasmine Paul, who's done extraordinary work towards reconciliation. And John has worked at Royal Roads University as well in helping to establish the conflict analysis and management program. So when I had a chance to meet with them, I brought them both together because of Jackie's way of talking about just having a cup of tea with the three of us, that we started to talk about what are the ways that we can connect this conversation. And we started with talking about polarization and how to work with the polarization when there really appears to be no way forward, when there's no dialogue. And then when I was speaking with John a few days ago, he had a framework that he wanted to start us with, and that we thought the conversation would go with a conversation between John and Andrea for the most part for 10 or 15 minutes, and then really welcoming other people. So please use the chat as much or as little as you like, and particularly inviting Awel or David to also speak about their experiences around peacemaking in South Sudan, but that this focuses really on the transferable skills that we all have in the peacemaking work that we do in our individual lives and our personal and professional lives, and particularly, as we'll talk about sort of how we can ground that in this method of insight that neither of them are like would consider themselves first and foremost insight practitioners. They're really master practitioners, or they probably wouldn't even consider themselves to be that. They do their work, and then it's up to the rest of us as well to sort of find the transferable skills that we can draw on in our lives. So with that, I'll just introduce John, or ask John to speak about what your early morning musings came to, and that we can start from there.
Thank you, Moni. Thank you, everyone. I just real privilege for me to be part of this summit this day and tomorrow. I do want to just acknowledge as a start where I am. I am actually on the land of the Sishak Nation. And so Jesse August and Jasmine Paul are part of that. I live here and I work from here, right? Which is just quite wonderful. And that is on the Sunshine Coast of British Columbia. And so I'm also thankful that today is Canada's first National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. And as you said at the start, Moni, and that was just, Jackie, that introduction was just fantastic. I do think it's a significant step forward for our country here. I really do. I think Canada, up until this point, has failed in one way in terms of truth and reconciliation. It's done a great job, in fact, in engaging with the nations around some of the structural change, which actually is a power shift in the country. However, we have failed in terms of engaging the power brokers, which is all of those of us who have the power, if you want, depending how you look at it, the settlers, the oppressors even in the system over a period of time. And so I think for the first time today in our country, there's the start of an engagement that's really quite significant. So I just want to acknowledge that. I want to acknowledge all of those people involved in all the little pieces, because I know it takes a lot to get moving in something as important as reconciliation and the truth established to it. The children in conflict that have been sacrificed is very close to my heart. And I'm not going to go there today, but really, really close to my heart. I struggle with that. Out of all the things I've struggled with over the decades, it's that. It's children, and nowadays we would call it collateral, right? I don't like that term at all, but that damage to me is significant. And it's been my privilege to talk to some of the children who survived in Canada and are now older, right? Significantly older in terms of age. But the child within still struggles and still hurts. So I just want to acknowledge that as part of it as well. So good to be here. And Andrea, it was great to meet with you. I want to use a term for you and Moni, which is a Zulu term. I was born into Zulu territory, the Zulu Nation's territory in Durban, South Africa, in Tegwani, which is the place by the sea. And there's a saying in Zulu, which is just a wonderful saying. It's Ngiyabona, which means I see you. And so I say to you, Andrea, Ngiyabona, peacemaker. So I see you, peacemaker. And it is an honor for me to be just alongside in this sense of it. And to you, Moni, as well. Moni's one of those people who, one of the things she does is to bring people together. So the very fact that you thought of doing this, Moni, it's a part of who you are. I do believe that peace is not the absence of conflict. I just want to say that. I think there's a misnomer that somehow peace, we get to a point where there's a resolution or an end point. I actually don't believe that, although in many of the diplomatic circles of the world, there's that as seen. But I see peace as not as that absence of conflict, but the ability to hold the tension of conflict in shared purpose, for some shared purpose. And the shared purpose creates a whole nother, well, what is that shared purpose? But that's part of bringing together. And so, Moni, even as you brought us together here, all of us, or created opportunity, you and your team, I say to you as well, Ngiyabona, peacemaker, to you, Moni. So I want to go on. There are so many layers to peacemaking. And just to kick us off here with Andrea, I want to just share a story that might be valuable, but I want to give it context. I think too often, and this is why I love the inside approach, right? And I use that word purposefully, love. I love it because it goes to another dimension. It goes to the dimension of the inner track of anyone in any conflict, and we're all in that. Right? And I want to go a little bit of a nuance on that today, which will hopefully be of value to all of us here in this conversation in this summit. And it's about that track is actually down to the personal track as we are involved in conflict. So we often talk about the people that we are working with, serving, facilitating, mediating, whatever the words are. But I want to just focus on us in the conflict and the impact it has on us and the value of that impact. And that's where insight is also useful. So that's the context in which I want to talk about this. So think, as I just share a little story here, think about that in terms of yourselves and the work you do, and in whatever role too. I'm not just thinking that you're facilitating. We have leaders, you're all leaders in your own way, but we have leaders who are here because they influence and serve others. So I bring that into the context. So I want to go back in time. I got involved as a mediator, trained in, we started a labor management or labor employer mediation service in South Africa, 1983. Got trained internationally, which was fantastic. People came from the US and from the UK to help us, train us and get us going. And it grew very quickly. And within a few years of that, starting that in around 1985, I was invited to help in the violence, which was in KwaZulu-Natal, which is the Zululand part of our country. And I said, no, I don't have experience. And I said, but let me try and get people to help. And so that's when I began to be in contact with other people. And through that, that's where I met Jim Lowy. That's part of that, and a connection I didn't realize with Andrea around that. And because he was at George Mason University. And just in passing, he said to me in the help, and this is what peacemaking is. He said, John, I'll help you. So I thought he meant, well, he'll help me for the next week or the few days he was there. Well, he walked alongside me for 9 years. I mean, just amazing in terms of help. And that's about peacemaking as well, that kind of commitment. So I sort of shift to the detail of the story. We were having a conference. So I got involved in the violence. People came in and I learned vicariously from them. I didn't learn the theory, I didn't learn the background. I began to explore the theory in the background, but I learned vicariously. And we began to develop as part of the build-up to, we hoped, a peaceful transition, the capacity of communities to engage in conflict, communities around the country. The predominant work at that time, there was violence in all communities, but the stronger violence was in a number of because it was apartheid, the Black communities. And in doing that, we were building capacity and working with community facilitators and training them. Thabo Malewa was a colleague and friend. And in 1992, we had a conference outside of Johannesburg. It was a group of around 40 or so of us who were involved in this conflict. And we would come together like this and almost share what we were struggling with and finding ways. And there were some of the international people working alongside us were part of that. And Thabo shared a story that stood with me and changed my life in many ways. Unfortunately, it changed his as well in an unfortunate way. So Thabo shared about the conflicts he was working with. And what we were doing then is we were sharing the stories we were telling ourselves about the conflicts we were in. So the stories I was saying, we were telling ourselves. And Thabo told us a story of himself in it. And he said, it's like, and he used the metaphor, it's like I've got the parties and we're in the small boat. And as we get into the struggle of what their struggles are, we're in tough water. And I purposely pull the plug on the boat. And as we sink, we come together. And I remember hearing it. So just think about that. Just think about what he just said in that time, right? And I remember feeling deeply, deeply concerned for Thabo. I remember later that evening over a beer and just talking with him and saying, Thabo, but there's a risk here in what you're doing. And I think about insight And I think about part of the risk that not only do we look at threat, and that's another part of insight that is so valuable in my view. I'm amazed that over 40 years, my 40 years, that we haven't touched threat in any real way and used it, in fact, to understand and work in conflict. And insight does that in very pragmatic, practical ways. And so I remember having that conversation with him, but I couldn't actually frame it. I didn't have the words. And there's a commonality in words and language around framing these conversations, discussion. We didn't have it then. I mean, if I think about today, I wished I'd had, or we'd had a conversation around it. But if you think about threat, not only are we understanding the threat that people have in each other, but also the threat that we have, that we can be threatened in the conflict, and that's the trigger part of it, but also the threat that we can be in a conflict system to others. So it's that dual part that I'm really interested in. And so I was talking about that latter one where Tabu, but you could be a threat to them. If you're a threat, you're at risk, at high risk. And so we had the conversation. I wouldn't say we completed it. I tried to connect, and we did connect because we were working in communities. And I was working in another part of the country to what he was. And the sad part was in December the 11th. So that was in 92, towards the end of 92. December the 11th, 93, he was killed. He was shot on the way, and I'll read the official TRC transcript. Just if it says, an ANC peace worker who was shot dead while on his way to officiate at a civic meeting in Tokoza, Transvaal, allegedly by IFP supporters. So these were political groupings in that area. On 11th of December 93, his body was found near a hostel in Ngadi section of Katlehong. And so that's the report. That was it. And he was amongst others who were losing their lives and being injured as part of working in conflict. I had worked on a way of involving people to see themselves in conflict, which I call relational mapping, and some of you I've shared that with. But Tabu lost his life. And when I think about it, in all the work we do and all the conflicts we work in, and I'm looking forward to Andrea's, I'll stop in a minute here, Andrea. But in all the work we do and what we involved in, there's a great value to understanding and also our vulnerability in the system, but also our vulnerability in ourselves, and we engage the conflict systems we work in. Not just to position ourselves to be able to help people, but in fact to give us an understanding of the systems we're working in. So it actually works both ways. And so that's where insight is, I believe, very valuable to help us, not only in terms of the parties, but in fact, in terms of ourselves as we interface with the systems in whatever form that we work with. And I'm gonna stop there.
Thank you. I'm happy to follow this very nice frame and interesting wealth of suggestions and nuances. And I would like to start with another memory, if you want. Not only is this friend killed, as you were sharing, this colleague, but two friends in Mozambique who were young, Madora and Laurindo. And they were among the first to start this community of Sant'Egidio in Africa. They met the community through friends, as always happened, and they started it in Mozambique. This was in late 80s. And they were killed. They were killed during the war. And it was the first time that somebody in our community was killed because they were who they were, right? They were not they were not doing something wrong. They were not part of an army. They were not. They were just who they were, and they were the way we saw it, the way we received that death. I remember very well. We were all in Rome, as the death of a friend who was actually part of a family. And I remember vividly that for us, this became a very important push to try to do peace in Mozambique, to serve peace in Mozambique. Sant'Egidio became the mediator between the government and the guerrilla movement. It was already, many of the actions were already in place when this happened. But I'm sharing it because I think that one of the beauty of this inside community that is forming is that we can grasp that whisper of life that Megan was mentioning this morning as something that we all belong to. So there is this strange moment for all of us of, on one side, discovering uniqueness. Nobody's me. I'm the only one who is me. I cannot be but me. I am unique as Andrea. Nobody else can have this experience as I have, but a well is a well, and Zoe is Zoe, and Viev is Viev, and Megan is Megan, and we are clearly bound by this uniqueness. So there is this age of uniqueness that is clearly blossoming. But on the other, we are clearly much more aware than in the past that we are also human. And in that humanity shared with one another, we can find extraordinary comfort, as this friend that I meet in a nursing home in New York, and he was sharing the other day that he was celebrating 25 years of life after a full heart surgery. And he was beaming, notwithstanding the fact that he had dialysis, that he was clearly aware of the fragility of his body and almost near death and so on. At the idea that a 23 years old who had an accident 25 years ago and donated all his body, gave life to 5 people. And so he was celebrating with me the fact that somebody had the ingenuity of studying the human body so well that they could take the heart of this person after he was dead to give it to him so that he could be alive. And I was amazed. This is a very simple person, not an academic, not somebody that is dedicated his life to thinking and so on. But I just wanted to share with all of you the progress we made in understanding our bodies so that we can take a heart of somebody and verify all the prerequisites and make sure that we can transplant that into somebody else so that this somebody else can live. And I'm thinking that collectively, what we are trying to do with conflict is an appreciation of the precision of the science that is required so that human can articulate this movement from uniqueness to humanity in ways that is not disrupted. And I need to share, I hope that nobody takes offense on this sharing, but I just came to Juba and I made a mistake because when I arrived at the airport, I saw a billboard with the South Sudan Council of Churches inviting peace for the country. So I was intrigued. I took my camera and I took a picture. And the driver immediately said, "Don't do that. It's dangerous in South Sudan to make pictures. You can be in trouble because you can be read as a threat." So I'm sharing this because the threat is constructed not just objectively on what we are doing is clearly constructed subjectively on how we are perceived. And the delicacy of this dance in which we are co-constructing each other all the time, Madora, Laurindo, Toby's, John Friend, and all these memories that we are sharing, is very interesting for all of us because it carries a responsibility of remembering, a responsibility of understanding, a responsibility of reacting, and I feel that it's interesting to have this conversation as a cup of coffee. I don't know if I would have the same conversation having a cup of coffee, but it's certainly nice to be with all of you and try to share this sense of the moment, in which I think we are inviting each other to understand how peace come about, how justice come about, how the future come about, how our life, will come about. And as far as I am with you, I am definitely delighted that we can see each other because in a different way, it's not the heart surgery, but it's a technologically similar feast, right? I'm in Juba, I'm able to see people in Canada, I'm able to see people around the world and be seen. So when John says, I see you, it's not just metaphorical, it's also true that he can see me in a certain way. And think about how much humanity, how much science, how much technology is behind this moment that we are sharing. Very little would make this conversation impossible. A Wi-Fi that doesn't work, and electricity that is not there, a computer that doesn't work, and so on. So I think that the glory of this human ingenuity and the fragility of that ingenuity, to me, is of great interest, because it seems to me that the challenges that we are facing are more and more of a magnitude that require collective action, collective understanding, cumulative capacity. So I'll stop here for the moment.
This ties in for me of what Megan started us off with around sort of the what recognizing both the cognitive dimension, the internal, as well as the social dimension, and how really it is our roles, that is that interface that what we do is based on what we know and value, and that how we act is through that role in the social, and that the social, the context, that the patterns of interaction will also act on us through that role of. In that moment, Andrea, you were no more than a picture taker. That was your role that could have then caused a harm, because you were sort of, people who take pictures are a threat, is how that would have been read by others, and they would have acted in a possible fight way, or that your driver then acted to protect you. He discerned the threat that you weren't even aware of, and he warned you. He chose, in his role as the driver, he again didn't have to be in the protector role. He just noticed that he was that threat, that there was that threat, and then he chose to be the interpreter for you of like, that's not something that we do here.
Or it could also be that he invented the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I have no way of understanding why. So it's an interesting thing. So what is constituting what, right?
Mm-hmm.
Who is.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But and so that's also very true. It's just sort of all of that complexity, and it makes me think a little bit, John, of what you were talking about around the whitewater kayaking, of that, about being in the complexity. And so I just sort of toss it over to you with wherever your mind was going, but that sort of that connecting, and that the precision that insight has around what it is that we're doing when we're knowing and valuing and deciding with the whether we can be truncated or expansive, and then connected with the complexity of the social context, can be that meeting point can be very challenging as well as an opportunity.
And thank you, Moni. And Andrea, as you were talking about that photo, it's as small as that, because, and it comes back, I think, to, I'll use that analogy of the white water, because it's a useful one. At least I've been thinking about it more recently, and I think it's useful. I think one of the things that has changed me through my peacemaking, if I think about the conflict work I do as a whole, and I actually think it's all peacemaking now, so I don't differentiate, but it's changed me in terms of the way I view mediation. very specifically, because I was trained in a fairly classical mediation. We were trained because, getting to yes had just come out in those days, right? So Fisher and Urey were popular, and I was trained that you control process as a mediator. And I think what's happened to me, I think partly through that experience of working in South Africa, and then ongoing, it's an ongoing learning for me, is I've learned that rather than controlling process, it's understanding process from the perspectives of the individuals and all of those involved. And I was amazed in peacemaking how much individuals can just one person or one or two people or can impact the outcome of international, of national conflicts at that level, community conflicts. So that shifted for me. The analogy I use is like, if we're involved in conflict, we've got to think about it. We're not just observing a fast flowing river where people are struggling on a raft or going down a river from the edge. We are in the river ourselves with the people we work with. And I think it's an important, I hold that in my head, that I'm in the river. And as I'm being moved around, so Andrea's example of even as he comes to the conflict system, taking a photograph, that impact on me and my impact on that system is critical to me understanding what's going on around me. I think one thing, if I think about when I'm threatened, and I use the word trigger, when I'm triggered on something, but when I'm threatened by whatever in my environment, that is my own self responding to. There's high value in that. And I used to train people to you need to manage that. You need to manage yourself in the conflict. I've shifted that. I've shifted it to, and it's much closer to where insight is headed and moving strongly. I've trained people to say there's value in not managing conflict, but understanding yourself in the conflict. So actually utilizing self, utilizing what's going on inside of you to understand what's going on with others and yourself in relation to that conflict system. Just one thing around white water. There's a really nasty canyon just near me here called Lynn Valley Canyon. And young people die there almost every year. The reason why they die is because it's a series of waterfalls, and most rivers are like this. This one's just got the rock formation, and they go over an edge and they get caught in a whirlpool. It's a vortex, and the natural thing when you're caught in a vortex is actually to struggle to get out. That will kill you in that vortex, because as you struggle, you become like a turbine. You get flipped around your whole body in that vortex. The way out is there's only one way out. And you've got to pull in. You've got to make yourself like a little ball, which is counterintuitive. And then you pop out of the water, right? And you have a chance of survival. It's no different, I believe, in conflict. So a key part, and this is where insight's so beautiful, is when I'm in that turmoil, I want to realize it. But the first step is not to push out. In fact, not to even try and get a bird's eye view or some context. It's to pull in. It's to go in, I'm using a metaphor, but to go into myself, to understand what's going on inside of this person right now, so that I can interface with you. So I add that into our conversation.
Thank you. And in many ways, what I think is interesting in this experiencing the conflict system and this invitation to interiority is that you can become more aware of the calling that others are suggesting or inviting. Don't do pictures is many things, right? Is the protection of don't get in trouble, don't put me in trouble, don't create, don't send messages that should not be sent, and so on. But also be aware that there is insecurity around you, that there is a certain degree of anxiety. But I remember when we were preparing the work in Mozambique and we were discussing the issue of how to move forward in the process in this conflict system that had this very difficult, far away, remote leadership that was in the forest in Gorongosa. And it became clear that we needed to organize a visit. And at that time was 1988. It was difficult to travel to Gorongosa safely, and it was clearly obvious to us that the best person to do this was this Archbishop of Beira, that was a good friend of Sant'Egidio. He was a native black nationalist bishop, and he was ready to do this trip. And it was extraordinary for me to see how that invitation changed him. So this is a person that was never trained, never did anything like this intentionally before, but was willing to take on the responsibility of a meeting that was absolutely decisive. It was also decisive because when he arrived in Gorongosa, he discovered that he could speak Ndao, the same language of the leader, and they spoke for 2 days in their own language. And as you can imagine, we got a level of intelligence and understanding of the situation that nobody had. It was just unparalleled to anybody. And then this bishop became one of the 4 mediators of the peace process and so on. The point being is that if we are attentive to this, to the whisper of Megan this morning, sometimes we can start playing a role that we didn't play before, that we were not trained for. But in many ways, I would say this is like becoming a parent, or doing things in life for the first time. There are many things that we are invited to do by life without any training, and we are simply responding to that invitation, possibly in a system that is helping you out and allowing you to learn the way you learn. And I feel that this is an important message for us as a community. Some of us do work in families, some of us do work in communities, some of us do work in police and so on. But I think that there is a meta level awareness of this interplay of the person and the society, the person and the community, that is valuable to all of us. It's this idea that life is inviting, we can act on that invitation, and we do have a community to come back to try to make sense of what is happening, so that the learning will not be just ours, but will be shared.
Yeah, just I'm watching time as well, but if I can squeeze in one more piece, is that all right, Moni?
Yes, and so just to give the sense of, we've got about 5 minutes of this conversation, and I'm hoping that Awel or David, if you want to say anything as well, sort of respectfully, but John, I want to make sure you have time, and then we'll have time in a small group to really reflect. We'll take a few minutes just of introverted time, and then we'll go back. We'll have time to reconnect with you and Andrea, and we'll do that more formally, but just that's the flow. So we have about 5 more minutes, John.
Okay. Maybe I'll step back. I can maybe share the story later if I need to, and give Awel a chance to contribute.
Hi everybody. If I may, do you hear me?
Yes.
Good. Okay. Thank you so much, Marnie, for this opportunity. I'm so happy to see you, John, and some of my former classmates, or still my cohort and my professors. As I was listening this morning or this evening here at Megan speaking, my mind actually was kind of raising, and I was kind of smiling through because I was comparing what I had learned to my past experience, like when I was young, and for some of you who don't know me, I was born and raised in several refugee camps here in Africa. I was born at the border of Ethiopia and South and Sudan by then in 1983. Then we moved to Ethiopia. We came to Kenya. From Kenya, I found my way through scholarship to Canada. I stayed there for a few years. I moved back, worked with UN, went back again, and now I'm back again, like in my birth country in South Sudan. So the experience that I have had with peacekeeping or peacemaking, I didn't know at that time that what I was doing was actually like, peacemaking. I'm beginning to realize it now, as I took like the classes, and have I become like aware, like what was going on. So when I was young, in Kakuma refugee camp, I was about 13, 14 years old. Myself and about 3 or 4 other kids, we created what we call Peace for a Spot, whereby we organize ourselves, like, in age groups between 8 years old to about 17 years old, and we play, and we're playing to make sure that, like, we could kind of create harmony among ourselves. And by that time, we were kids, we weren't very much aware, what was keeping us, like, in the refugee camp, and most of our parents here back home, we know there was war going on, but when there's conflict, like, they have this thing that, like, inside awareness sort of question that you ask yourself, and at that time I didn't have like enough awareness to kind of ask myself, okay, what is going on, how is this thing affecting us, what is going to happen. But after I had gone now to do my higher education, when I joined Royal Roads, I began to be curious. I began to kind of ask curious questions that kind of invoked my awareness. And that was the time. By that time, I was now involved with peace talk in Addis, for our current conflict in South Sudan. In 2014, 2017, 2018, I was involved. And then by the time I took like this course, I begin to kind of initiate, to what are their threats, and then from there we kind of, pave way forward. And I think that how, like, now the current peace agreement we have in South Sudan is actually based on that. At that time, I did not realize it, but I came to realize it after I took, inside approach, courses and training and all this kind of thing. I came to realize that for us to have got a sustainable, okay, so I almost cut off there. For us to have got a sustainable peace, I feel that, like, I need to figure out, or at least try to understand, what are the possible threats, and if those threats are addressed, how is it going to minimize the conflict, and how are we going to try and sustain peace agreement that, like, we have at the moment. I'm speaking, like, on the capacity of the current role that I'm involved in it in my country, as a South Sudanese, trying to find a solution for a long-lasting peace in South Sudan. So to me, to use my experience that I have gained through the course that I took, or maybe like as a student of conflict analysis, is exactly helping me in one way or another. So in short, that's what I can just say, because we have got a lot of, we do not have a lot of time, but thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Awel. And David, did you want to say anything briefly as well?
Yes, I would love to. Thank you, Mari, and thank you, Awel, for that statement, and thank you, everybody, for giving me the opportunity to say a word to this wonderful gathering. So Awel's story is most of our stories about our conflict in South Sudan.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, David. Is there any, is everyone having difficulty hearing him, or is that just me? Okay, David, I wonder, can you, if you have a microphone, can you get closer to it, or just, it's very, very faint.
Can you hear me now?
That's a bit better.
Okay.
Okay.
Our story is most of our stories. the conflict in South Sudan now has different dimension from the old conflict that we had in the old Sudan. And having learned that Dr. Patali was going to be participating in this gathering, and having learned that he is also an expert in this inside approach, gave me the hope that the issues that are now being blocked by political suspicions, framing one another as enemies when we are not really enemies, can be opened up so that all of us can learn why we are creating some false threats that are not necessary for our well-being or for our lives. So in my view, I think the current issues that are pending the flame right now in South Sudan are not really the issues that are supposed to be the one driving the agenda. So there are some false narratives that are being given to the mediators, and the real issues that are really underrooted in what I would call mistrust and misunderstanding are not being addressed by the current leaders that are trying to bring peace to our communities or to our South Sudan, because most of the leaders are now just only representing what I would call their personal interests. If they were to be representing the interests of the people, so they would really go down to the roots of the conflict. And this kind of misrepresentation is also giving the mediators less leverage to go back to the root of the conflict, because the individuals that are interested in being mediated are not giving the real issues. Because, for instance, if you go to South Sudan and ask that, you know, are there any other narratives to the current conflict? The leaders will not tell you no, because they wanted it to be addressed shallowly so that they can go back to it, because it has become a business. It has also become an accommodatory process where elites are just trying to forge some first-class status through this conflict by gaining resources or by gaining some status that are not necessary, at least to address the conflict. So for me as a person, I've been involving in this mediation, but at the very, very low level through the communities, through counties, through land demarcation at the county level and also state levels. But after learning conflict analysis and management processes, I was able also to go back and advise some of the leaders in our country on how they could open up to challenges that are not being brought to the surface by the blockage that they have created. Mm. And I believe if you could give those individuals that are participating the opportunity to go back to the community and also involve the grassroots into the process, not just through those representation that are not 100% created by the local communities, but those representation also seem to be done through self-appointing, through NGOs, through elites that have their own personal representatives at the grassroots levels, but the real victims are being sidelined, and their voices, you will never hear them. So I appeal to you to look deeply into how you can bring a lasting peace. And also when you are framing this kind of peace, so you may be also looking into how you can prolong, you know, the mechanism that would guard this peace from falling apart. Because politicians are running after deadlines. If you give them 3 years or 2 years, they'll wait for that and then go back to what they were doing because there are no mechanisms. So if I could stop right there and in respect of your time, thank you so much.
David, just thank you so much for providing sort of the levels of detail and context in that specific way that you did, with all the complexity that you've named about expanding, like the narratives are very limited and the roles are very limited and the participation is very limited. And those are lessons that we can learn in whatever context that we're in around how with that effective threat, that it does tend to truncate what is possible, that the possibilities seem very limited. And that then self-interest or self-preservation becomes a kind of a default rather than what is best for all or best of self and other, and that sense of interconnection that we've been talking about. And it's that when there's a level of threat personally, there's that sense of truncation, and that happens collectively as well. And this seems like a good spot to sort of transition over into our small groups discussions as well. And so I'll sort of, if that's okay, to just pass it over to you, Viev, to kind of guide us into that, where we'll then have a chance to process this ourselves and then go back into this big group again.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you to all 5 of you, really. And there was so much that was said on, kind of touched on so many different places and different levels. And before we go into our small groups, and you'll be, to use someone wonderful, I think it was Jackie's word, beamed in to your small group. So you don't have to do any choosing, you'll just be beamed in. Let's just take, I'm going to set a timer. Let's take 2 minutes. And Awel said it just beautifully when she was starting to study insight and was doing this naturally anyway, but just to check in to what's going on, just what's going on right now. So for 2 minutes, we're going to sit together in community, but check in, go into the interiority of ourselves and wonder what's going on. Okay, wonderful. So from that place, we are going to be beamed into rooms. And Marnie and John, you were going to provide us with a animating question so that we have a guiding question for our groups.
Okay, so this is what John and I do. And Andrea, I also wonder if this is something that you'd like to chime in on, is what kind of question can we take from the conversation that we've had that can help people sort of do this at another deeper level around self? John, is there a question that comes to mind for you and that can connect this? we could think about how can I, one of the questions I was wondering about, how can I use my bias to make an influence in the system that I'm in? Maybe something like that.
Yeah, something about ourselves in the systems we're in would be really useful, right? And I'm thinking, what about this? How does insight inform my understanding of where I am in the system? That might be, I don't know if that's too complex, but how
it might be too insighty for not
sure.
everybody having insight. So, but it might be something about how can an understanding of threat and, because we've talked about threat a bit, but I think there's something about how can I use, or maybe something around vulnerability, that sense of vulnerability and confusion help me get oriented to making change.
I like that. I actually quite like that, Maria. Particularly even using the vulnerability piece in it. I think that might be even better than threat, because that implies threat or could imply threat, but doesn't limit us to threat as well. So.
Okay. So the question then being something like, how can I use my vulnerability and sense of uncertainty? And I use my vulnerability. What do you think about that, Andrea? And sense of uncertainty. Okay, of uncertainty to help me in my peacemaking efforts. How about that? I'm putting it out in the chat. We'll just do one quick edit. Anything else on that, John?
No, I'm good with that, Moni. That's great.
Okay. All right, that's our question then, everyone.